Hello, and thank you for listening to Critical Thinking is Required. You're about to listen or watch our Critical Thinking is Required Literature Series 2. So this is our second part to this series, and there's really no part 1, part 2 like we had for For a New Liberty with Murray Rothbard, because that was a bit longer. This is a short, it's a 20-page document that you can read that I'll have a link to the actual document on the website, criticalthinkingisrequired.com, so you can actually read it yourself if you want to. It doesn't take very long. You don't necessarily need to read it because we're going to cover everything at the same time. Or maybe you will read it, and then you can use this kind of as a supplement to kind of further your thoughts and ideas regarding what you read. And so today we're going to talk about vices are not crimes. And just to let everyone know, this is the second time I've read this, although it's been a long time. And I really enjoy Spooner, and I like the sense. This is by Lysander Spooner, and it was written in the 19th century. It was actually in 1875. And what I really enjoy about this book and about him in general is that this is, almost 150 years ago. I'm estimating up a little bit, and a lot of these things could be similarly said today. Whether it be the politics of all his books. I mean, you can look at the list of books that he's written, or whatever they're called, but the little short articles that he writes. And it's the same thing that I was talking about with For a New Liberty, how a lot of this stuff could similarly be applied today. And so it's just that you have to have that outlook to make sure you think about what is the best way to share freedom and to help people maybe learn about it, or just to understand that they see it every day. They just need to apply it in government and other institutions. So we're going to talk about vices are not crimes. And so, what are vices and what are crimes? What are the differences here? Well, I actually Googled vices, and it's actually some sort of tool that, those tools you use, I think, to hold things in place when you cut. So I thought that was funny. But vices, defined by Spooner, are the acts by which a man harms himself or his property. So it's the acts by which a man harms himself or his property. And there's a lack of intent to invade another person or his property. So it only deals with when you harm yourself or your own property. That's what a vice is. It's that type of act. A crime, in contrast, are acts by which one person harms the person or property of another. Okay, so the difference here is intent, and then it's not just you. It's not a crime to hurt yourself, is what Spooner is basically writing in this whole thing. It's a vice. But to hurt another person and to invade his person or his property, that would be a crime. And so vices, well, basically these things that we do that are vices, where we hurt ourselves, well, they're often errors made by man in the search for happiness. So Spooner writes a great deal about this thing where what life seems to be about, maybe it's a natural part of human life, is to search for happiness. And every act by man either causes happiness or unhappiness. So just think about it, right? So every act that we have, that we do, so we do an action, right? This goes back even to human action, which we'll probably cover in a future literature series. But if you take an action, it's either going to have really a positive or a negative consequence, right? And so it's either going to cause happiness or unhappiness. And the errors made by the person in search for that happiness, because that's the end life goal, those are called vices. And this result is determined by each man himself. So it's not by other people, it's determined by you. Because again, it's something, a vice is something that you do onto yourself or your own property. It cannot be done onto someone else. That would be a crime. And it's determined by each man himself because we are all different biologically and environmentally. So biologically, our genes, our time in history, although that could be environmentally as well, because that's our circumstance, where we're born up in, what type of community, what part of the country, what part of the world, what time and era of the world that we live in. All these things could have, think about if global warming's real, and let's say that is, well, if there was a global cooling, like there was in the history, there's going to be different rules. There's going to be different things that you are going to do in your search for happiness that you might not even think about, but because of the way society is going to react to those situations and to the environment, it's going to change you as well. So there's all these different situations, biologically and environmentally, that impact you. And so again, we're all individuals here. We're all different. No two people are truly alike, although we do have things in common. But what one man thinks is a vice can be virtuous to another. And the same thing the other way around. So what I think might be a vice, and we're going to have examples of what he gives as vices, I might not actually think those are vices. Or I might add additional ones that maybe he didn't think of at that time, or that it didn't exist at the time, that I will try to explain as well. And I'm sure you can come up with many vices that I don't even think about and that he didn't think about. And so basically this search for happiness, it's a study that takes a lifetime. It occurs from birth to death. And even then, you might not necessarily be happy. So it's something that you're continuously, it's like how I said critical thinking, and how I define it as endless curiosity, is that it doesn't stop. You continue to do it, and even when you think you discover the truth, whether it's libertarianism or whatever, or maybe love. Maybe you think love is the answer to everything, right? Maybe equality. Well, continue to think critically, continue to ask questions, because that might not be true. And so he looks at the degree. So the question of virtue or vice is one of degree. So it's not the intrinsic character of any single act alone. So this comes back to the idea of the fact that everyone is different. So if one thinks one thing is virtuous or one thing is a vice, well, it's about degree. It's basically saying, well, this could be, like, imagine a spectrum. And on the YouTube page, if you're watching the presentation or you're looking at the show notes, and you can just review the presentation if you don't want to watch it or listen to this anymore. And you can see, I have the famous political test, where if you're in the bottom left, you're libertarian left, bottom right, libertarian right, libertarian, Democrat, Republican, authoritarian. So there's all these different sides. And that follows with this idea that everything's a degree. So no two people are going to be exactly on that. Now, of course, if you only have 5 questions, then yes. But if you had all the questions that could apply, and you could somehow make a test that would apply every possible imaginative question, which is impossible, even then, no two people would be alike, right? We're all different, and it's all a matter of degree, of what we think is a virtue or vice. And so vices versus virtue. So we're going to kind of look at the characteristics and kind of tell the differences between the two, besides the definitional. And vices are usually pleasurable. It's something you enjoy. But it may not disclose themselves as vices. And it's often the failure of life experiments. So these are, again, it's your journey through life, learning your path towards happiness and understanding happiness. And usually it's something that you're going to enjoy, but you might not even think that it's actually a vice. So you might go, oh, this is innocent enough, but then later on it might seem problematic. So for example, with me personally, how I did a reflection on using Facebook, that was a vice, because when I first started using it, maybe about a year ago, because I was a little late to this whole smartphone thing, I was using it all the time, and it's like I carried the phone with me everywhere I went. Sitting at dinner table, I'm constantly looking at my phone. Out in a restaurant, constantly looking at my phone. In the car, everything. And now that I don't have Facebook, and mind you, I wasn't even doing anything productive with Facebook. And now without Facebook, now I just have it on the computer, and I just look at it every, maybe 2 or 3 times a day, unless I'm in a conversation with someone. And at that point, I don't look at it as often, so I don't carry my phone around with. I have it near me, but I don't look at it near to the degree that I did before. And so to me, that would be a vice. Virtue. So compare that to virtue. Well, virtues are often harsh and rugged. So that would be a characteristic of a virtue, is that it's going to be hard. It's not easy. So in contrast to a vice, which is easy, it's easy to give in to that temptation of Facebook. But the virtue of being generous or being kind or respectful, it's hard to be respectful. I'm doing it on Facebook, having conversations about the show with people, and people being disrespectful towards me, that it's very difficult to respond with respectfulness. And that's a virtue, that you have to find a way to either balance it or to be as respectful as you want, because that's how you want other people. It's the golden rule, which I'm starting to believe more and more is the fundamental rule if you're going to do anything, even beyond non-aggression principle, because there's so many things. Okay, but yeah, side. And virtue requires sacrifice of present happiness. So it's self-sacrifice in the sense that you're going to give up that thing that could be pleasurable, that vice, in order to have that virtue. And the results are distant and obscure. They actually may never appear. So you might die, and you may never actually understand that what you did was virtuous. Maybe you've constantly, and I'm not trying to get to like altruism here, but I'm just trying to get to the idea of a virtue in the sense of trying to help yourself, which helps others, right? And it has that effect of helping others. And hey, if you can do that, then that's virtuous. And I don't know if that made any sense, but we'll get into some examples of virtue. Now, rule by government. Well, and here's the problem: is that life is a search for happiness. Remember, that's what he wrote about. It's endless. It's subjective. It's one of degree. We're all individuals. Remember, we're not this magical group where everyone shares the same feelings and vices and virtues. So, what sense does it make for a body of men, assuming that a government was even legitimate to begin with? What sense does it make for them to determine what causes happiness or unhappiness? It doesn't make much sense, because the search ends, first of all, right? Because if the search ends, because they declare themselves that this is the vice, this is the virtue, right? This is what causes happiness. This is what does not cause it. This is what causes unhappiness. And so they're not going to look at what other things might cause happiness. I mean, and we're going to talk with like the drug war and how we can apply that as well. And if the body of men actually searched inwardly and looked at themselves and had self-reflection, which is very important for everyone, they would find that they too have their own vices and unhappiness. And those things might not be crimes, because they don't want to look at themselves. They don't want to punish themselves, so they're not going to make those crimes. So a lot of it is hypocrisy. That's the problem here. One of the biggest problems with government intervening and prohibiting vices rather than crimes is that if government were to choose vices to punish as crimes, then to be consistent, so if they are going to punish vices as crimes and they're going to say that gambling or prostitution is illegal, then they must choose all vices as crimes. All vices. So again, Facebook, repeatedly looking at Facebook, being mean to people. I mean, there's greediness, lack of self-control and self-discipline. I mean, these are all things that apply to everybody. Being rude, again, you define, of course, you can come up with your own, what you think are vices and what you think are virtues. And it's harm to yourself, so you got to think about it, that's what a vice is, so think about what that is. Well, for me, being disrespectful to other people is harmful to me because it brings negative energy. It causes me to be mean, and it's going to lead me to be potentially meaner to other people. And then when I come home after being mean to others, I'm mean to the people at home, and that's not right. That's not virtuous. And so if that was a crime, because that is a vice to me, then everyone would be in prison. And so there's the hypocrisy, is that you can't do that. So the government and the ruling class has to pick and choose. And so instead, government punishes a few vices. But again, what right does a body of men have to say that some vices should be punished rather than their own? And I have a picture of lottery tickets. I mean, it's the state itself is in charge and controls this stuff, distributes it, uses it for their own good, a little bit of it, whatever that means. Uses it here in Florida, we use it for education, supposedly. But that's a vice, right? I mean, I think most people would agree that that's probably a vice, that it probably does some harm. But again, we're all individuals, so we may disagree. But it's legal, but only to government. And what right do they have to do that? And then with internet could have so many vices besides the internet itself. You could have Facebook, you could have Reddit, you could have 4chan, you could have so many things. Pornography, messenger services where you're just talking to someone. That could cause relationship problems, or family problems. So there's all these different things that computers themselves could have as vices. And again, if you make these things illegal, then why not the others? Otherwise, you're a hypocrite. Makes no sense. And so everybody has a natural right to defend his own person and property against aggressors and the defense of others whose property or person is invaded. So this is the natural right? This is the natural right of man as established mostly by the Libertarian Party and in this type of philosophy. Not Libertarian Party, libertarianism, okay? And in the sense what we talked about in Murray Rothbard's For a New Liberty, this is the same idea, right? We all have a natural right to defend ourselves and our property against aggressors. And then we also have this right, now I don't know if I agree with this, I'm still analyzing this idea that we have a right to defend others whose property or person is invaded. That worries me a bit. And you'll hear a reflection, I think, soon about me in the article I wrote about pushing the red button, or the magical button that would end the state. And I have a problem with this part, is defending others, because it worries me. It's for some reason I have George Bush's voice in my head saying, we need to instill democracy in Iraq. Like it's the same kind of concept that worries me a bit. But we're all individuals. And if government must exist, it must be limited to this natural right. That's what Spooner is asking for. And that's actually what I would agree with, too, that if it has to exist, and this is where I'm a minarchist, and hey, whatever. Like, what am I going to say? If it has to exist, it should be limited to this natural right and the non-aggression principle, basically. And why would people grant away their own right to seek happiness? And it's against human nature, right? So the crimes are few. So this is easy. Most people would agree where crimes are. We can say, most of the common law type crimes like theft and murder and burglary and robbery, all these type of things, they deal with that property rights. They deal with that natural right that was just discussed. And most would agree. I mean, I bet you if you had a poll of some sort that 90% plus would agree that those things should be prohibited. Now, they might disagree on who should prohibit those acts, but those things, rather than in contrast with vices, most would agree. With vices, few would agree. That's where you get into sticky territory, and you cause these divisions, you cause these divides. It's all about politics. It's all about how you can spin your story on why marijuana should be illegal, because it's a vice, because it causes damage to oneself. And so they have to kind of sell that. But no, you can't necessarily prohibit something else that does the same thing. And I mean, reading, there was a time, and I still read a lot, but there was a time I was like heavily addicted to reading, where I was reading numerous books every week. That could be a vice. Like, it sounds weird, but to some people it could be a vice, right? If you're just doing too much of something. It comes down to that key of moderation, which I've always tried to live up to, but it's not easy. And why would someone wish to be protected against himself? I mean, why do you need someone to protect yourself? That doesn't really make any sense, because human nature would say that you have this idea of self-preservation. I mean, you want to survive. So unless you're suicidal, which could happen, of course, why would someone want someone, especially someone who could put you in jail or kill you or fine you and enslave you, basically? Why would you want that to happen if your human nature, that way you're going to act naturally without any intervention tomorrow, is to preserve your own life? You're not going to continuously commit vice after vice after vice. You're going to use it as a learning process, right? Now, of course, there are problems of addiction, so that could be something that could be discussed. And I'd love to see history regarding addiction in the 19th century or before, like whether this stuff happened and how they defined it, because I'm sure it's a newer invention, because that's, there's money to be made there. And of course, there are people with actually mental disorders or mental problem. I mean, to be fair, we all have mental problems, but to a degree, right? It's all different to a degree. And the question is, should someone else step in? And I think, this isn't on the PowerPoint, but that's a perfect example, I think, or a decent example is, let's say you prohibit being addicted to sex or something like that. Well, that's a question of degree. And so if you have to put this body of men in charge to determine this rule to say this amount of sex is prohibited, but this is okay. And that's okay, like, we're all right with that? Like, that doesn't make any sense. It's hypocritical, and it's against human nature. Well, it's not against human nature. It's against human nature in the sense that it's against the self-preservation, because I'm not going to, someone who's addicted to sex, let's say, they're not going to have sex until they die. They're going to stop eventually, right? And mistakes are needed. And here's the more important thing, I think, the concept too, is that we all make many mistakes, and but we have to make these mistakes, because from these mistakes we learn and seek happiness. Without making mistakes, one of the things I've realized in my life is I've made some really big decisions in my life. I mean, joining the military, a decade ago or whenever, that was a huge change forever from me. And I don't know whether I'd call it a mistake or not, but let's just say it's something that I did in my life that forever changed me. and I've learned from it. And I can think of countless of true mistakes that I would define as mistakes that I've learned from as well, and some that I haven't. And I continue to make mistakes. But again, life is that journey to seek happiness, and you're going to continue to make mistakes. You're going to continue to think about it. Maybe you hit rock bottom, whatever it is, and you're going to change. Now, of course, I don't think that puts aside the very, 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 very small percentage of people who, even after hitting rock bottom, don't change, right? Because again, like he wrote, even you could die and you'd still not know. You'd still not find happiness, right? I mean, that's a problem for everyone. Parents who attempt to make their children virtuous do so by keeping them ignorant of vice. So that's one of the problems. One of the things we think about with helicopter parents or something, if I just let them watch a certain type of show and I shield them from vice, well, what's going to happen? I mean, that doesn't make any sense because I'm keeping them ignorant of unhappiness. I'm saying that there is no unhappiness. It's always happy. And so Spooner writes this is a coercion, of course, if the child is reasonably competent. So you have a problem there with the non-aggression principle, I suppose. But you also have the problem of shielding them from this idea that when they do find out the vice, because they will, they will learn of this vice, that what you did as a parent could result in significant negative consequences. Or maybe not, I don't know. But it's something to think about. But don't we need government to intervene? Doesn't government have to intervene here? Don't they need to prohibit vices? Well, government has no rights in the matter if the person is sane and capable of exercising reasonable discretion and self-control. So these are quotes. This is a quote from Spooner himself in the book. They have to be, so government has no rights if the person is sane and he's, quote, capable of exercising reasonable discretion and self-control. And I think I talk about it later because I have some of these problems with especially seeing the court system and seeing when judges say people are competent, which is basically, I mean, sometimes they do, they'll have a psychologist or someone review, but when you give a voluntary plea of guilty, let's say, and to discover what something is voluntary, so whether you are capable of exercising reasonable discretion and self-control, they say like a page worth of, well, are you under any drugs? Is anyone forcing you to do this? Are you sure you want to do this? Yes. Okay, you're sane. It's like I don't know who determines this stuff. And he actually says government should, which I don't know. But once found insane, their friends, neighbors, or government may intervene. So interestingly enough, he does mention friends and neighbors. And I think that's what he was focusing on, especially as an anarchist at the time in the 19th century. Is that I'm sure he's taking the minarchist position as many of us do today, where it's kind of like the pragmatic approach. But he thinks, and I think most of us would agree, that if someone is insane, if someone does have to intervene, it should be the friends and neighbors, family first, and then maybe government, if at all. So some examples of gross vices that Spooner saw, again, in 1875, so in the late 1800s. Gluttony, drunkenness. Drunkenness was a huge situation. You're going to hear more about that. This was the era before the Prohibition. This is on the quest to get there. This was a huge deal. Prostitution, gambling, prize fighting, tobacco chewing, smoking and snuffing, opium eating, idleness, waste of property, avarice, greed, hypocrisy. So all these things are things that I think we could apply similarly today. And some that are actually prohibited by law, and then some that aren't. So there's that other conflict too. Is that what one sees as a vice might be a virtue to another, but it also might be a different degree of vice that might not be prohibited for some reason, when in fact it's still a vice. So example, if you're throwing away property all the time, if you're throwing away trash, I mean, we recently had someone from Hungary stay with us. And she was amazed by how much trash we throw away here. When we're done eating and, maybe we had leftovers or something and there's just food left over. Like, what do we do with it? Well, we throw it away. We have these things called garbage disposals. Yeah, they're horrible because they basically tear all this garbage away that we're wasting. And that's something I could work on, right? That's an example of my search for happiness and reflection, of thinking about what I do and how I can use less and conserve, right? And that's individual. I don't have to be forced to do that. We can all do that individually. It's part of life. And hypocrisy, that's a huge one to me. And he had one that was corset wearing. So I have a picture on the YouTube video or the show notes with a woman probably in late 19th century wearing a corset. And that was a vice. So that was bad at the time. I mean, can you imagine that today? I mean, this is nothing compared to that. So how do we determine sanity? So this is important because he basically said that if you are sane, then the government has no right to intervene, right? But if you are insane, then the government can. Well, we determine this sanity by legal tribunals, just like they do for anything else. So when he talked about wills, so when you say someone's will, he's sufficient, he has the sufficient mental, capacity to make the contract or a will or something, well, then he would have the sanity here. And any doubt must weigh in favor of sanity. I think we can all agree with that, and government has the burden. Now, of course, the government has a burden in passing certain congressional laws that are passed easily because, well, the government works for the government, right? So, of course, even in these legal tribunals, you have the government in charge, so you have to worry a little bit by that. So what I'm saying is that if the government prohibits a vice and they have judges who are in charge of enforcing the vice, then how hard is it to believe that the judge is going to maybe be supportive of the government? Because he's employed by the government, he is the government, right? And we talked about that in For New Liberty as well. So where liability may be found? Well, if a person becomes insane, or another should know of it or have reason to know he's insane, so here I might have another disagreement with Spooner, it is then a crime on the other man to give or sell to the person the means of self-injury. So this is really interesting. So an OK law, an example that he would give is that it's illegal to sell booze to someone who drank too much if he showed dangerous propensities. So maybe if there was a law, that basically made that illegal, right? And you're the seller, you're a bartender, let's say, of an establishment, and someone is a patron there, and he's just drinking shot after shot after shot after shot. He's kind of swearing, cussing. Well, that's not enough. But once he starts, maybe he's like hitting the table, or I don't know something like that. But once he starts doing those type of things, then see, I don't like hitting the table. It's dangerous propensities. So let's say you knew that in previous circumstances he had punched other people after he left, after he had the same amount of shots. And he did it like 5 times in the past 10 times. Well, then it could be illegal. And he said it's justified, right? And that really interests the craziness out of me, because I still have to ask the question of the non-aggression principle, and whether, and back to in the beginning too, is that, that natural right idea where no rights have been violated at that point. So if the guy had done stuff in the past, but he hasn't done anything yet, yes, maybe if he took a cup and threw it at the wall, you could say there is a violation of the owner's property, right? So then you could throw him out, or you could do something. You could stop selling stuff to him, or I mean, you could do that regardless. But that's my point, right? That would be where the non-aggression principle would be violated. But it's not, I don't think, as far as up to that point where he's just drinking. But Spooner says that that's okay, and that would be a justified crime. And so it's a crime even if the person is only dangerous to others. But it applies, and here's where he makes sure he tries to watch what he's saying, is that it applies only to the person and not others. So you can't the law has to be specific towards a specific individual. It couldn't make it illegal to everyone, okay? So it couldn't prohibit drinking, but it could prohibit drinking in that circumstance that we gave. But it must also be shown to be dangerous. So dangerous is a key term. But again, it's so problematic because you have government determining what dangerous is. It reminds me of who the gatekeeper is, of when someone, man, I'm having a real brain fart, but when they're what's it called in Florida, where if you have like a mental breakdown, they can basically arrest you and put you in, like, I don't know if they put you in the mental institution for a short period of time or some sort of service like that. But the bottom line is they determine that they can do that. It's nobody else, right? So we're putting these deciders who aren't, there's no checks or balance, there's no price mechanism, they're a monopoly, there's no one to control that. And that, to me, that's worrisome. And remember, vices are not nuisances. So he wrote this specifically, that no act of one person can be a nuisance to another unless it in some way obstructs or interferes with that other's safe and quiet use or enjoyment of what is rightfully his own. So again, this goes back to nuisance law that we discussed in an episode, public versus private nuisance laws. And this is something that libertarians are big on, that can sort of be problematic because it's this kind of broad concept of interfering with the safe and quiet use or enjoyment of what someone owns. So it's not necessarily just trespass, but let's say I live in a community and you build there's no rules in our community, let's just say, and you build your house with polka dots and you're the only house like that and every other house is historical. Well, some libertarians might even agree that could be prohibited, whether it be through some private institution or through some government institution, because it would be a nuisance. And so he gave an example of an obstruction of a public highway, and then a non-example is where a hotel where liquor is sold. So I think what he's focusing on is the idea that just because you sell something that could be a vice, that doesn't make it enough. It's the same as any other store, basically. They sell products too that could just as much be vices. And we can look at, prescription drugs, Tylenol, selling laptops, selling computers, selling video games, selling books. Back to my problem, right? Those are examples of where, well, if those are sold, then why can't liquor be sold? It doesn't make sense to prohibit that. Unless, of course, you're insane. So he goes back to the view of if you're not of legal competent age, then yeah, you could maybe prohibit the sale of liquor. So I think the age there was 10 years old is the consensual age for sex in some statutes at that time, which is interesting. Again, they gave so much power to kids back then. It's just amazing. And so maybe 10 would be the consent, but of course now it's 16 or older for many consent laws regarding contracts as well. So enticement itself is not a crime either. What if one person entices another into a vice? What if I say, dude, I got some weed, man. Let's smoke this. Let's just do it real fast. Come on over. We'll have fun. We'll watch a funny, Harold and Kumar goes to Hollywood or whatever the newest one is, right? It goes to McDonald's, whatever the movie is. And so that's what we would watch. But that's not a crime, right? That's what he says. It's not a crime to just entice someone because to the willing, no injury is done. So if they're willing to participate and they're not insane and there's no fraud used, then it's okay. It should not be a crime. And so again, some other examples of vices that are not crimes was the prize fighters, sex, gambling, assisted suicide. So assisted suicide, again, it's to the willing, no injury is done. So that's something that's prohibited in the United States in many states, if not all of them. And it's a vice. It's not a crime is what he's saying. Again, it's harm to oneself. Gambling is harm to oneself. Sex is harm to oneself. Prize fighters, MMA fighters, killing each other. Dueling was something he even mentioned at that time. You're willing, you're both willing, you live with the consequences. Those are not crimes. And that was interesting because even dueling, where someone could get murdered, even that's not a crime because you're consenting to it. Because by taking 3 steps and turning around and shooting someone, you're sort of consenting. It's an implied, you're expressly consenting. So the question then is, well, doesn't drinking lead to crime? So again, drinking, prohibition, all that stuff. We're creeping up to the prohibition era. Doesn't drinking lead to crimes? Well, great crimes are mostly committed by avarice, greedy people, and who have ambition. So think about this. Well, first of all, government, right? They're the greatest criminal of all time. Now, you might disagree with that, but let's look at, again, we talk about war. I think this is he didn't say this, but this is definitely the easiest analogy here, is that war is basically mass murder, right? People overseas in Iraq or in Vietnam, they did not consent to being killed. And there are many, maybe the soldiers, maybe you can make an argument, right? But not the innocent family, the innocent people who did not fight or who did not participate, did not vote, did not do anything, did not grab a gun and shoot back, right? And yet we've killed the government, United States government in the past, since its founding, has killed over 50 million people through war. So they're the greatest criminal of all time. So shouldn't we punish them? I mean, if the argument is drinking or marijuana or even underage sex or, sleeping pills or college assault, sexual assault, that's a new thing now. Well, if that stuff's illegal, then shouldn't we make government illegal? They're the greatest criminal of all time. I mean, you can't deny it. And then theft, we can get to taxation, but maybe you don't agree with that. But I don't know how you could disagree with war. I don't think there's any way to do that. And at the same time, cool and clear heads. Those are the people who commit crimes, are the people who are calm and collective, who are thinking about what they're doing. Do you think that, that people who drink are going to start to commit crimes? Okay, I'm about to rob a bank, so I'm going to take 5 shots of whiskey. That makes no sense, because now you're drunk. It's going to be much more difficult for you to be successful. Now, I'm not going to say that there aren't people who would do that type of stuff. Maybe, people who take meth or something. I don't know. But generally, that's not what's going to happen, because you want to be successful generally. And so people who do drink, and if they are criminals, it's probably just assaults and batteries. Now, that can be problematic, of course, but it's just this fear tactic of saying that, we need to prohibit drinking or marijuana because people are going to start committing crimes. Well, let's look at those other things that we talked about. And even if so even if we admit that drinking does lead to crimes, well, why put the person in jail for drunkenness and then ruin him for life? So think about it today. Why, if our point is to help society and possibly even help the person, right? That's one of the reasons why vices are crimes, right? That's why the government thinks so, right? Is to help him. Let's intervene. Let's help him. Let's help society. Well, are we really helping society by putting this person in jail for 20 years for something as stupid as possession of drugs or selling it? And then when they come out, they can't find a job. They can't do anything else. And so he's ruined. And we've basically degraded him to his basic part of, down to the bone, that he's in this jail, maybe with people who are actually criminals, who can be scary and abusive and violent. And so you have multiple problems, and it just doesn't make any sense. And then, doesn't drinking lead to poverty? So this is another argument that he heard at the time, and I think you could equally apply it to marijuana or any vice today. You could look at gambling. We should prohibit gambling. We should prohibit marijuana use or any drug use, heroin use, whatever, because it's going to lead to poverty. You're going to keep doing it. Well, if you're going to prohibit the sale, then you should also prohibit the use, right? So even marijuana laws, it's often possession and it's sale, the sell of it, that's prohibited. It's not necessarily the use. So if you're going to prohibit those other things, well, at least to be consistent, of course, government doesn't like consistency, but if we're going to be consistent, and of course, there is some realm for inconsistency, I think, in things, because nothing's perfect, but this is a big inconsistency. Because again, if the sell, the possession, then it should be the use as well. And even if so, let's say the government could prohibit drinking because it leads to poverty in some way, well, then couldn't they punish every act that leads to poverty? I mean, think about it. If you think of someone who plays video games or stays up late at night and doesn't study or doesn't do homework in school or doesn't listen, doesn't pay attention, doesn't sit at their desk, comes in late, couldn't we punish them? And couldn't we make that illegal? Couldn't we throw them in prison? And why don't we? I mean, it makes no sense. It's so hypocritical. The basic foundation of those two arguments is that they're the same. If you're going to put them in jail for this, then you should put them in jail for that. There's no other way around that. And then the government is really under no obligation, of course, assuming they don't make the obligation to intervene and help people who are drinking that could lead them to poverty. But of course, the government at this time, at least, I don't know how much it was in the 19th century, but they have made that obligation, so they sort of, I guess you could make an argument that they should. But again, we still have these other problems that we've just discussed, and we will. So the incentive to labor and create wealth is to dispose it to promote his own happiness. So the reason we don't want to be in poverty is because we want to be happy. So that's one of the foundations. Now, of course, I think you have problems with communities, and you have, not communities, but of circumstances, right? The environment, which is usually caused by government, through government policies that we discussed too in other episodes were like inflation, like Federal Reserve, like fractional reserve banking. One of my favorite, those three things are huge. And that affects you and your ability to labor and create wealth. Taxation's another one. Education and free public education, that if you had to go through and you had to live up with it, and maybe you didn't learn what you should have learned, right? And so we're going to act in our own happiness generally, right? We're talking generally. And that any mistakes that occur, well, that's wisdom, that we learn from that stuff, or at least we should, theoretically. But that's what he's saying, that it's beyond theoretically, that's in fact what we do. And that maybe we don't learn it now, but we will, or maybe we just won't. And moreover, is it that drinking leads to poverty? So here's the last question he asks, is it that drinking leads to poverty? So is that the correlation or whatever the problem is? Or is it that poverty leads to drinking? And he spends his last 2 pages discussing poverty and how there needs to be more understanding of poverty and why it's there, the concepts of it. And we'll be talking about that, I think, in a newer literature series. We'll be talking about Henry George and one of his books about poverty that I haven't read it yet, so I will be, and I think that'll be an interesting one that you can listen to. But that's the episode. That's the second literature series. That's the whole thing. Vices Are Not Crimes by Lysander Spooner. I thought it was a decent read that should have provided everything you needed to know about the book. Hopefully you can think about some stuff as you listen and go, well, what is a vice? What is a crime? What do I think are vices? What do I think are crimes? What's the difference? Why does it even matter? Hillary Clinton quote there. But I think it's a decent episode to think about. If government has to intervene, when should they intervene, and whether they should indeed. And then even with Spooner, who's an anarchist, of saying, like, even if, because I assume some of these rules that he has with, like, when you're selling something and you have reason to know, that kind of thing, where liability would be found, that stuff would also be applied probably in private institutions. So it's still something that just because it's a private institution, we can still think critically and say, well, just because they're going to have it, does that mean that we should? Because shouldn't we just go down to the basic core of the non-aggression principle? Should we really have the right to intervene in other people's lives? And that's a question, even if it's for their own good. And who defines what's in their own good? And I go with this with the voter thing and the pushing the button, is that even if you think freedom is the ultimate answer, how do you know that that's what they want? And who gives it to you to make that decision? Aren't you initiating violence and aggression against them? I don't know. It's something to think about. But thank you for listening to this show. Make sure you check out criticalthinkisrequired.com. And as always, think critically.